So, good evening, all, and welcome. It's beautiful to have us all here. So, at Boqer School of Government, we teach biblical principles and we try to extract things from the Bible that we can apply to contemporary governance and government systems. In our first class, we considered the Christian and his ballots. The Christian and his ballots, and we emphasized on Isaiah 33, verse 22. Where the Bible said, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king, he will save us." We began to draw in that class that what we today call democratic governance is actually an extension of God's reign. Because what the Greek philosophers taught and was eventually found in American Constitution as the three arms of democratic governance were already in the book of Isaiah, even before the first Greek philosopher considered them. When the Bible says in Isaiah 33:22 that the Lord is our judge, that's talking about the judiciary. The Lord is our lawgiver, that's talking about the legislator. And the Lord is our king, that's talking about the executive, he will save us. So from that class, we began to teach that all of these derived powers, whether they be exercised by men, whether those men be Christians or not, that these powers are godly powers. And so that when men find themselves in positions of responsibility, whether they are doing monarchical system, military dictatorship, or democratic governance, that the powers they exercise are powers derived from on high. And those powers should be exercised as someone who will give account of those powers. And from there, we began to say that initially it was not appointed for man to choose who his leader would be. That there were two kinds of civilizations, really. And then the first civilization is what we call the house built by man. And then the second civilization is what we call the house built by God. By this, we considered, for instance, that there are only two ways people can build civilizations. That they can build civilizations based on what man thinks is right. And then they can also build civilizations based on what God says, "This is my concept, this is how I want you to do it." The first civilization that was built by man was what you could call Babel. And then from there you got your Babylonian Empire. And as we know from history, Babylon and Babylonian Empire had moved from city to city, from continent to continent, from place to place. May not call themselves Babel or Babylon, but then eventually when you look at Babylon and when you look at those civilizations, you can't find the difference because it is the same philosophy, it is the same line of code. If you talk to computer engineers, the same line of code that roots the first Babylon that will continue to write eventual iterations of Babylon. But then the second kind of civilization is the one that we said was built by God. And from this, we begin to talk about the way God operates. That God operates in sequences or in series. For instance, when he wanted to create man, he could have ordinarily created 7 billion people. And then when you close your eyes and open it, you have 7 billion people hovering around the earth. But in his preferred manner, he chose to create one Adam. And then from that Adam, he chose to create Eve out of him. And from the two, they procreated until today. Statistics says that we are now over 7 billion people on earth. He wants everybody, but he starts with one. You'd also see this with Jesus Christ, that when he came to his earthly ministry, he could have evangelized the whole world, but he started by drawing the first, second, and eventually the 12 disciples. Then from 12 to 70, from 70 to 120, today we can't even number the many Christians we have world over. That indeed he would have said, "Oh, we want everybody to come into this new kingdom." And then he would have started off running from Asia to Africa to the Americas, trying to evangelize everyone. But then he picked his 12, built on them until we have what we have today. You also see it when God was trying to establish a model civilization on earth. Because after the fall of man, he began to look at how do I show the men in this world what a godly civilization looks like. And he picked one man, Abraham. And then in Abraham, he said, "I will make you the father of all nations," not one nation, but all nations. And by implication, it means that through you, I will create one model nation. And then this model nation is supposed to be a model for the rest of the world, pending the time I will do the redemptive work that will now bring these nations into the fold. And so you had from that you had your Abraham, down to Egypt, where they were 400 years in Egypt, up until Moses came, from Moses to Joshua, and then from Joshua to the promised land, and then you know the story from there. And so that civilization was the one we are considering. The civilization that was built from Abraham to this point. Why are we considering this? These are not the only modern nations we see around, whether we're looking at the scriptures or whether we're looking at other historical concepts. That you had your other nations, for instance, you had the Egyptian Empire, which rose to the zenith of its glory at a point. You had the Ottoman Empire, you had the British Empire, you had, and even this China that is now waxing strong today, had been an empire before, the Han Dynasty, doing exceedingly well. But then power comes and goes. So then civilizations also come and go. So we will touch on those civilizations, the Han Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, what you now have in America, what you had in Rome, the Roman Empire, what you had in Egypt. Why are we looking at these? We're looking at these because we want to consider these frameworks, especially now that Africa is beginning to lay the foundation stone of its next few decades if Christ is to come. And so we would see that for all these civilizations, they built those civilizations according to the wisdom of man. But then if you look deep down when we get to that, you will see indeed that they did not build those civilizations according to the wisdom of man, that they built those civilizations according to supplied wisdom. And then we will consider who supplied that wisdom. But for the civilization that we're considering, that of Israel, we saw that their kings were appointed by God. In fact, in the first place, he did not allow them to have kings. He allowed them to have judges. He was their king, as Isaiah stated. He was their lawmaker, as Isaiah stated. He was their judge, as Isaiah stated. And in all the operations of God, you will see these distinct government operations of God at play at every point. For instance, when you look at the Garden of Eden, you will see that this God was Adam's lawgiver. He says to Adam, all these trees you shall eat of, but this particular one, do not. That was a lawgiver giving his law. What you had there was what you could call legislation. It was a lawgiver giving a law. And then he was the one that says, oh, now that you've broken the law, he now put them in judgment. I have put enmity between you and the woman. I have caused the earth for your sake. I have done this. I have done that. That's a judge. That is judicial pronouncement. And then eventually he sent his angel to drive them out of the garden. That's a king executing the decisions of the court. And then even till today, that some of those pronouncements he made at that garden is still in force today because there is a king enforcing the pronouncement of the court. When he walked with Abraham, you could see him function as sometimes as Abraham's lawgiver, sometimes he functions as Abraham's judge. For instance, the time he functioned as a judge, he asked Abraham, this matter between you and your wife, I have taken a judicial decision on this. This is my judgment. And so he functioned in the three realms. The first law and all the laws indeed they operated by was enacted by God himself. It was God who wrote the 10 commandments and gave to Moses. Then even after he lost the first commandment, the second iteration of it, he wrote it under prophetic instructions and wrote not from his mind, not from his head. And so there can be no civilization, we've gotten into our class today, without the fundamental concepts of what we could call state constructs or what we could call norms. The way a civilization is built, or the way a country is built, or the way a society is built, first there are conceptual underpinnings that sustains the superstructure. What I mean by this is that anytime you go into any society, if you begin to look around, you will find that it appears that the people are behaving in a particular way. There may be some people who may be exceptions, but then the general attitude of the people is tilting towards one direction. And then once you see the general attitude of the people, if you look deep down again, you will begin to see the norms and the philosophies that they run their societies by. There is first of all the theoretical framework on which every society is built. There is the software of every society. Let's use that word, software. That every society, whether they be advanced, not advanced, third world, first world, whatever world, that all societies have this philosophical underpinning or a certain way of life or a certain accepted norm that this software forms the basis or the foundation on which the superstructure is built. For instance, in certain environments, you will see that the environment is that of hyper competition, where the philosophy seems to be that dog eat dog, snake eat snake. If snake no eats another snake, snake no go grow. So when you look at, for instance, in cities, when you go to Lagos, you will see the fundamental underpinning. If you go to the United States, you will see the fundamental underpinning. If you go to UAE, you will see the fundamental underpinning that every society tend to have this unknown code, maybe a code or a software written by someone somewhere. And then everybody tends to be operating by this governing philosophy. And so we will find that for these nation states that we are considering, their moral code was written by God himself. And because he wanted a particular thing out of that civilization, and he began to give them codes. This is how you do this. This is how you do this. This is the laws of marriage. This is the laws on priesthood. This is the laws on business. This is how you run your economy. Because if you remember from the last class, we said that there are two ways nation states achieve full capacity utilization. By full capacity utilization, we mean, what do you do to a third world country before it becomes a first world country? That is full capacity utilization. Like today, we are crying about Nigeria and many African states. What do you do to this Nigeria before it becomes a first world country? And in most civilizations, we've seen that what they do is what you call exploitation. First, the well-to-dos or the haves, I think it was Malthus or someone who divided the society into the haves and the have-nots. The haves begin to exploit their environment. People first start exploiting their environment. They start exploiting the land, the mineral resources, the natural resources. Eventually, they move from exploiting the mineral resources and the land to exploiting people and individuals. So you see that the well-to-do, the more agile, the more endowed, the more gifted, the more eloquent, the stronger species, so to speak, begin to exploit the weaker species. And it is only in that exploitation that they begin to achieve near full capacity utilization. But then a time comes in their exploitation where they find that, look, there is only few men in our country that we can exploit. There's only few available mineral resources that we can exploit. And therefore, after they have achieved the highest degree possible exploitation within their own network, they begin to export exploitation. And sometimes this exploitation of exploitation happens in brute wars and conquest. That they attempt to subjugate another people and force them to be paying either royalties to them or to become their slaves or to become an extension of their kingdom so that they can extract mineral resources there, extract the raw materials there, and indeed extract the human resources there. Other times you will see that this exploitation is not in the form of brute wars. It could become, for instance, slave trade, that people begin to appropriate slaves. And then if you look at civilizations like that of the US, that of British Empire, many of the Western societies you see today, you will see the slave component of their growth. And because that is the way they understand capacity utilization, we cannot achieve success until we bring people who can work for us for free or who can work for us at a wage that is solely determined by us. This is how man finds full capacity utilization. But that is not the only thing that man does. After exploiting himself, exploiting his immediate environment, and then exporting exploitation, for instance, during the time of the British Empire, you saw them going into voyages, moving into several African countries, moving up in the West, moving around them, trying to force countries like Nigeria, all of those places, into what they call protectorates, and eventually they started colonial administrations. And these were ways that nation states or civilizations exploited. And in all of this, the goal of the expansion is to have more, to be more, to acquire more, to do more, right? That is the goal. And in this doing more, you tend to see that the philosophy becomes, if you don't exploit another, you will not have. If another has and you don't take it from him, you will not have, and you will not have much more. Then there is another exploitation that you tend to see using immigration policies. And you see this with perhaps countries like Canada, that when they have an aging population, for instance, they will, through skillful immigration policies, begin to attract health caregivers to take care of that aging population. People in nursing, in medicine, in physiotherapy, and other related fields. And that is why they can use their immigration policies to edit the destinies of people in other nations. And so today you have a lot of people who are saying, I'm going into nursing, I'm going into this, not because God called them into that, but that is their response to the immigration policy of another country. Because this country now needs health caregivers. So they edit their immigration policies to suit their current needs. And they attract those immigrants to come and do the job. When they are in need of menial labor, especially during the time of visa lottery, when they need menial labor, they will start doing visa lottery. And in the visa lottery, you will see that the people who are winning the visa lottery are the people who can fit into the current need of the society. So if they need menial laborers, they will begin to bring in people who don't have the qualification. Or indeed, if you have the qualification, perhaps you have a first degree in your own country. But then when you come into this new country, you will be made to see that your degree cannot serve them. And you have to go under to start doing menial jobs, janitors, cleaners, this and that. So that is also your form of exploitation using immigration policies. Why are we studying this? We are studying this because Africa will soon take off. And it's important that we understand all these concepts for us to see the kind of concepts that will predicate our society on. There's another concept of exploitation that you could call what is being done in the United States today. United States is not so much into using immigration as a tool of exploitation. United States is now using outsourcing as a tool of exploitation. What do we mean by outsourcing? For instance, the law in the United States says no worker should be earning less than $15 per. I think the $15 is their minimum wage and all of those things. You must pay health benefits, pay health insurance, pay retirement benefits. By the time you take care of this worker, you will not make much profit according to the wisdom of man. And so, to achieve full capacity utilization, they now begin to learn how to export jobs. And so a lot of the American brands that you see today, iPhones, we don't call the American brands, many of them are not produced in America. They are shipped to Vietnam, they are shipped to China, they are shipped to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to places where they can now, instead of paying $15 per hour, they can now pay these people $2 per hour or $1 per hour. Now, their law in the place where they live protects workers from being overburdened. But then they can now ship those jobs to countries that don't have labor protection laws. And so, whereas they cannot treat their own citizens like that, they can now export those jobs to places where those citizens are no longer in their countries, constituting nuisance for them. But you are in your own country, but you're doing the bidding of someone else's. If you look at the chocolate value chain, you see, for instance, that 94% of the resources or the proceeds of chocolate goes to the management, goes to consulting, goes to marketing, goes to everything. The farmers who actually plant the cocoa receive only 6% of the proceeds of chocolate. And then even the people who sit atop the executive management of big chocolate chains, they don't produce it in their countries. They ship it now to other countries. It's only Switzerland and a few countries that are still producing in Switzerland. Others, they export the production of this because they want to achieve full capacity utilization. How can I grab more and lower down the cost of production? And this is what man sees as full capacity utilization. There are other means, other ways countries or civilizations try to exploit. And then they can exploit their environment. You see the unmitigated exploitation of the environment. The mad scramble for lithium. Now that we're talking about renewable energy, green energy, if you really look into green energy, you will see that there is nothing green about green energy. The cobalt, or the nickel, or the molybdenum, I think they call it CRM, critical resource minerals, the CRMs that you use in the production of solar panels, in the production of battery cells, in fact, the whole gamut of the renewable energy value chain. All those rare earth metals that you use to produce them. The excavation of these metals leave the environment even much more degraded. And so you saw it also from the mindless excavation of petroleum, that it left a lot of environmental degradation in its wake. Today, even the renewable energy and the clean energy and the green energy, that the processes of getting the green energy is not green, it is not clean, and then these people know. Though they go to Paris, they go to Dubai, and they speak all the theory they want to speak about climate change and all of those. But yet, immediately after that conference, you still see them in copper mines in Zambia. For instance, what you have in Zambia today, the trending news is that there was this mine that collapsed and you had miners trapped on that. And then these miners are working for people who are not in the country. The people they are working for, the people they export these resources to, are people who are in distant places. But then from there, you start exploiting, because man's knowledge or system of full capacity utilization is exploit one, his immediate environment, then exploit his outer environment, and then exploit the human resources around him. That is civilization according to man. But then you now see the second civilization that we're considering, that God was careful that even the environment, he wrote their environmental laws. He told them, you're only farming for 6 years. In the 7th year, allow the land to have its Sabbath. This is God who is giving you a template for how he wants the earth, because you can't use the earth, you can't use the resources he provides you in an unsustainable manner. I'll go to Anambra, for instance, that in the mad scramble for building, new buildings are coming up every now and then. And by the way, Anambra State has this propensity for gully erosion. But then there is this important resource that is needed for building. It is called laterite or red earth. This red earth is the one that you use to fill up foundation. The red earth is also the one that you see them using when they are constructing roads and bridges. But then when you see the unmitigated excavation of red earth, people can just see red earth. They will just put in excavators there, caterpillars there, tippers there, and they start excavating. Before 5 years, that place has become a gully erosion site. And they leave it and go to another place to start excavating. They leave it, go to another place to start excavating. This is man. He is in constant need. We want to build. We want to excavate sand. We need sand. So he is not mindful of what his developmental process does to the environment. What he's interested is in achieving the goals for today. That is full capacity utilization in a civilization or in a house that man built. But in this new civilization that God built, you will see that he carefully writes the environmental protection laws. He writes laws as to how you can treat your workers. He writes laws as to even how you can treat the animals that work with you. Where, for instance, they said that the ox that threshes the wheat, you won't cover the mouth, because as it is threshing, it must have to eat from what it is threshing. So not only are you not allowed to mistreat the environment, you're not allowed to mistreat your workers or your slaves. You're also not allowed to mistreat the animals that work for you. But in alternate civilization, you find that man tends to believe that if you don't mistreat your workers, for instance, if you read the story about Ford, you will hear about a lot of people. Ford, by the way, a very innovative company, a very entrepreneurial CEO. But then when you hear people who, for instance, were dropping dead at factory lines because they were hard pressed to work under inhuman conditions. And people in factory lines were dropping dead because you are not allowed. You are just allowed a few hours of break to pee, to wee, because you must work at certain hours for the day for the company to achieve its targets. If you now go into the corporate world, maybe in Nigeria, in banking sector, there you have a lot of targets, sometimes outrageous targets, and because you must drive your workers, you must drive for you to make maximum profit. This is civilization according to man. Because man's need is unmitigated profits, this need for profits. And then you would see that according to God's civilization, you will still make money. And in fact, sometimes when you consider, it appears that people who apply themselves to this kind of civilizations, even in some cases, make more, much more than the people who run the other civilization. But then there is a law as to how you can treat your workers. You mustn't treat them unfairly, clearly spelled out. And there are scriptures to this. You can't mistreat the environment, clearly spelled out. And there are scriptures to this. You can't mistreat even the animals. There's clearly spelled out. There is laws to this. Let's, for instance, go to Isaiah 41 verse 6 to 7. The Bible says that everyone helped his neighbor and said to his brother, be of good courage. So the craftsman encouraged the goldsmith. He who smooths with the hammer inspired him who strikes with the anvil, saying, "It is ready for soldiering." Then he fastened it with pegs. So you see that this community that God built, or this civilization, is a civilization that takes care of each other, that is closely knit, that each unit supplies. If you go now to Ephesians 4:28, you will now see what it says. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his own hands what is good. Why would he work? The Bible says that he may have something to give him who has need. Not only are you discouraged from stealing, you are discouraged from stealing, and then you are asked and encouraged to work, but you are not working so that you accumulate resources. You are working so that you can now take care of the vulnerable in the society. So even for the vulnerable in the society, in the new civilization, they are taken care of. And that's why you see that some of these things were now baked into the constitutions of countries. For instance, when you now hear social intervention programs, these were offsprings of the scriptures. But then, how God designs social intervention is not that social intervention becomes a government policy. Social interventions does not necessarily have to be a government policy. Social intervention becomes a function of the heart of fellow citizens. That it is not designed to be a government policy that you now have shelters for people who can't have it and all of those things. That it was designed that really a neighbor takes care of his neighbor. But when you now start running this hyper civilization, for instance, where this neighbor does not even know the name of his next door neighbor, because all of us are in this hyper competition to achieve, where if I have a company that is doing well, then another company must have to come and take over my company in a hostile manner so that they will grow. Where if you have a tech company and there is a rival tech company, you must have to force them out of business so that you can be in business. Now, if you have that kind of society, and you have a society that runs under that philosophy, over time, the society begins to see that, look, there are vulnerable people in our society, and our laws have made it so much so that the vulnerable is left even more vulnerable, because we have taught men to be in hyper competition with each other. We have also taught men to be in aggressive push for what they can get. And then in this aggressive push, you will see that the vulnerable are left without nothing. And then the government says, okay, since they are left without nothing, they have actually started constituting nuisance because they can't eat, because they can't feed, because they don't have clothing, because they don't have shelter. And then the government, in trying to solve a problem that was created by the society, now attempts to say, okay, we can now start handing out school feeding. We can now start handing out this, for instance. We can now start handing out this, for instance. So what should have been a societal way of life, that a neighbor looks out for his neighbor, but then this neighbor has been primed by the society to start competing with any and everybody, now leaves the vulnerable. So in the house that man built, social intervention becomes a government policy. In the civilization that God builds, social intervention becomes a societal, it's not necessarily a government policy. It is written in the hearts of men that once you see your neighbor, that even the person who used to be a criminal is now encouraged not to be so much so of a criminal, but now someone who can indeed help. That will bring us to the last part of the series today, which is, why do we have to do this? Africa, whether or not we believe it, is rising. And it's not a cliche. Because if you look at what is happening globally, the tide has left the West. And what you see in the West is the function of what I call old glory. But then if you see that the tech companies, the tech giants are no longer in Britain, America is still trying, but then eventually America will stop being the dominant player. You will see that it is the turn of Asia now. That what is happening in China is happening in India, is happening in Indonesia, is happening in Malaysia, is happening in all of the Asian countries put together. They are not growing at the same rate, of course. All fingers are not equal. But then you see that there is this tide that is lifting the whole of Asia. It's a tide. It's lifting the whole of Asia. And Asia will stay around that tide for between 40 to 70 years or less. And then it steals back to Africa. But then when you see how the West built the West, they built it on exploitation. How was Britain built? How was this British Empire built? On exploitation of other people's mineral resources, on the exploitation of other people's human resources. How was America built? On the same philosophy of exploitation. You also see that exploitation happening in the whole of Asia. If you go to China and you see the way factory workers are treated, because when they say China is growing at 8% GDP per year, you need to go to the factory and see how factory workers are treated like robots to produce. China and a lot of Asian countries started by exploiting themselves. But today they are now exporting exploitation. That they are now going towards Africa, they are now going towards all of the other countries to one, exploit the human resources, and then two, exploit the natural resources or the mineral resources. Not just the mineral resources, but the land could be exploited, the water could be exploited, the solar rays could be exploited. Every other thing that they can exploit will be exploited. And after this, Africa will now come off as someone who has been battered by the West and then battered by the East. And it is in this process of this hurt that Africa would want to extract its pound of flesh by attempting to recolonize, for instance, America, recolonize, for instance, the West. And some of the things we are seeing here will be far-fetched. They will seem far-fetched for the unstretched mind. But then, if you look at it, you will see that civilization happened in Africa, in Egypt. May not have started there, but at least Egypt was a civilization. We also know of Ethiopia was a great civilization. And as at the time Ethiopia was in its strength, America was nowhere. Britain was nowhere. They were not factored into the equation, right? But then eventually the tide turned. And today it then appeared that people who don't know history will think that Africa does not have a history and Africa does not have a manifest destiny. What we're saying now is that the men and women here will be part of the people who will build this new Africa, or at least plant the seeds. And so that we'll have to be mindful of the pattern we want to build on. Whether we will build on this aggressive get all you can and can all you get, or we can now try to build civilization according to biblical pattern. Civilization that takes care of one, the environment. Civilization that takes care of two, the human resources. Civilization that takes care of even the animals. That is the kind of civilization that Africa could build. But then, if Africa is not guided aright, Africa will do what it saw the West doing, and Africa will attempt to do what it saw the East doing. That is the end of this edition. It's now time for the interactive session, which is usually where it gets more interactive. So at this point, I'll invite people who have questions, clarifications, arguments. You don't agree. This is why I don't agree. I agree. This is why I agree. I have a question. Could you please signify and then raise your hand, and then we can pass the mic around and then have everyone who wants to contribute to make their contributions.
This is Simon. It's a pity that I missed the first 11, 12 minutes of the meeting, which is pretty large because of the time allotted for this section of this discourse. But towards when I joined, I picked up a few things which I want to talk about in reaction to, or in response rather to your lecture, if I call it that. When you were talking about the capitalist tendencies and all of that, and how that in the house that God built, that you are not supposed to, or you must not mistreat not your worker, not even the animal that's working for you, and that exploitative tendency is the order of the day for capitalists and the house that man built. So, but I usually come into, I usually have some discussion with some people sometimes. I hear them say that I am not Jesus Christ to save the world. That's when you want to talk about that. Look, you are here for a purpose. You're supposed to, the wealth you have in the first place, first and foremost, was given to you by a higher being, it's God. and then that it was supposed to go around. That is the essence of you having it in the first place. That's when you will hear them respond to this saying that I am not Jesus Christ to save the world. My question is this: with people already having this mindset, generations, I don't know how many generations that started thinking like this up to these hours, how can we be able to turn the tide?
Thank you so much, Mr. Simon, for your question. Every civilization is built on first, there is the software and then there is the hardware. When you go to Lagos, for instance, and you see the hyper competition, you see the way people rush buses, you see the way people, they can't even, the road can be free, but people cannot allow you to overtake them. It's just, even the roads, people have been primed to start fighting over road usage. Someone might not even have somewhere they're going to. But then, you that is in a hurry because you have an emergency, an airplane to catch, or an appointment to catch, or a critical emergency, they can't yield way because the society has been primed at the core level. I don't know how to explain this, but the core concept of life for them is hyper competition. Don't give way. No darling for this Lagos. So that kind of, you are not Jesus. No darling. Shine your eyes. Be aggressive. This is Lagos. So don't be, you know they not. You know they is. This is like, you must be aggressive. Those kind of philosophies are what you usually see before you see the manifestations of this on the surface. So when you see people competing, okay, whereas Abuja is not so distant from Lagos, but if you have driven in Abuja and you've driven in Lagos before, you will know that they are entirely different experiences. Not that the people in Abuja are more humans, but at least the scarcity of roads in Lagos has caused this kind of editing. That has edited out empathy. It has edited out sympathy. It has edited out the need to empathize with someone else. That everybody is now, I must get, it's a software. And then you ask yourself, because you said you missed the first 11 minutes. And I said that because one of the things I said during that 11 minutes is that if you actually look at it, it is not a house that man built. It is not man that built that house. But then it will take us a lot of time to prove that it was not man that built that house. That it was another thing that built that house. Because look, man on his own that is unaided cannot build a civilization. Like if you had listened to our last class, where do laws come from? We have found out that laws come from transcendent beings. And so these philosophies, who taught Cain that you must kill Abel? Somebody taught him. Okay, let's ask, where does inspiration come from? If you now understand where inspiration comes from, when people say, oh, I had a flash, I had a thought, I was inspired. Who inspired that thing you called inspiration? It is usually a supplied energy by the Spirit. And then if it is not Holy Spirit, if it is not Jesus, if it is not godly, then we know where it's coming from. So whatever tells people that you cannot give way to somebody, whether they are dying or not, that you cannot give way, that is your right, and that you must enforce it to the later. Whatever inspired that kind of thing, whether through lived experience, whether through informal training, it has become the predominant lifestyle of the people. Now, how do you get those people out of it? You educate them out of it. And that is part of what we're doing at Boqer School of Government. And what I believe other people are doing. If you see the philosophies that business entities run by, and they've seen what it does to the society, and they're now beginning to teach ethics, you don't do this. But someone you have told that the whole purpose of life is to make profits. And not that profit is bad, but that the whole how to make profit is to lower down your cost of production. When you go to business schools and you see the knowledge they share, not all of them. When you read, for instance, books like 48 Laws of Power, and you ask yourself, these laws of power, who made these laws? If these laws were written indeed by a man, under which inspiration did he write these laws? When you look at Machiavelli, people who are Machiavellians, who want to, run their lives using Machiavellian principles, and you see it is Machiavelli, it is Robert Greene, it is 48, there are a lot of them. And this is at the intellectual level. Then at the basic subsistence level, where men are not even conscious of the laws they operate their lives by, for instance, the Lagos example, where people don't even know why they should be competing on the roads. They are not going anywhere, but they won't give you space. They don't know why. But they are running their lives by that. It's a law that has been written for them. That it will take you a higher level of consciousness to see that this is the law, it will not apply to me. That even in Lagos, I can still retain empathy. And so, if you want to educate people out of, by the way, those people were educated into that norms. They didn't come out with it. It was what they had people do. Someone did to them, someone said to them, someone indoctrinated them into this kind of belief that if you want to take them out of it, you begin to tell them, this is, and by the way, what we did today is to look at the house that man built. We have not advertised the advantages. Because indeed, there are advantages to building godly kind of civilizations. We didn't go into that. Maybe if we do the second iteration of this class, we might go to other topics, and when we have covered the big grounds, we can now. But then you would see that the house that man built must always collapse eventually. Because those people you exploit will come to a point when you can no longer exploit them. And that is why British Empire is crumbling. Has crumbled eventually. But then, you know what I usually say to people? Empires are like ceiling fans. Take note of this. Empires are like ceiling fans. When you turn on the ceiling fan immediately, you don't start feeling the effect. It takes some time before it rotates until it achieves maximum oscillation. That is when you start feeling the breeze. But then when you turn off the ceiling fan, you can still feel the breeze because it will rotate until it comes to a grinding halt. So for some civilizations, especially that of the British Empire, which was built on hyper exploitation, today those countries that used to supply the resources are no longer there. Then even when they move to neocolonialism, that even some of those nation states are now breaking out of this neocolonialism, that now they can no longer thrive on free commodities or cheap commodities. They can no longer expect free raw materials. They can no longer expect slaves. So because they built their civilization around exploitation, once exploitation becomes unsustainable, you lose that civilization. America today does no longer have slave trades that can do the rail tracks, and that has slowed down growth. And then if you looked at America over the past 40 years, yes, they are still the world dominant force, but the rate of growth has slowed down. And then if you watch life, you grow, you come to a mid-age and then terminal decline. If you also look at what is happening in British Empire, they had a lot of countries under them, exploiting the human beings there, exploiting their mineral resources, exploiting their natural resources, exploiting their raw materials. Today, they can no longer do those kind of exploitations. And you see that the economy, for instance, did you guys know that India is the fourth largest GDP in the world now, has overtaken the UK? UK is now behind India that it exploited. And so when you now look at tech giants, you see that India is emerging. You can't find that in the UK. When you talk about groundbreaking discoveries, of course, the UK, the fan is still rotating, but mind you, it has been turned off. So it is not sustainable. But then this is much more sustainable than exploitation. So to capital, your question was, what do? We start educating. Of course, we do know that not all will agree. Not all will see reasons with us. But then it's good that we tell people you have an alternative. You can build a company even in Nigeria right now and you treat your workers with dignity. You can have a thriving business, yet you pay your workers well. Did you know that some companies, you are oscillating between depression and anxiety because they give these hyper unrealistic targets that you must meet. And because people don't have alternatives, they must meet the target. That's why, for instance, in today's banking sector, it's the hyper targeting. What you must do at the end of the month. That's why a lot of people have lost their marriages, have lost their families, because they must have to meet a target. So in this civilization, it's important why we tell the people, even if we're 20 here, we can tell the 20 people here, you can treat your colleagues fine. You can treat your staff fine. You can build your companies around godly civilizations. Who tells you that you will not achieve much until you start underpaying people, until you start cutting people's salaries? There are companies you go to today, once you come 10 minutes past the time, they cut your salary. But if you come 10 minutes earlier, no incentive at all. That's not the only kind of civilization. We will start with educating people and telling people that you have alternatives. I think that's where I will stop on that. Please don't grow despondence. You look at Jesus, who is our model, that he wanted to evangelize the whole world, but then he started with a few. And during that few, the wickedness was multiplied. The wickedness was everywhere. Men were still doing what men do if they are not helped. But then he had to take his time to nurture 12, 70, 120, and eventually the rest of us. So keep doing what you're doing. And I won't say lower your expectations, but just be a little bit realistic that humans will still be humans, that even when you've given them options, that they can still choose. But then our work is to at least give them options. Because for a lot of young people who have grown into this dog eat dog thing, that's the only thing they know. And that's why you see at workplace, people are snitching on each other just to get favor. Because they think I must snitch on this person so that the boss will like me. I must do... No, there's no idea of collaboration. It must be hyper competition. That even when they are collaborating, they are just waiting for an excuse or an opportunity to strike, because they think that you must go down for them to go up. And that's what they teach them in that crab world of pulling down people. But then in this new civilization, because you are a subset of the community, so if Haruna is making progress, it's affecting the community. His progress is rubbing off on all of us, right? If I'm making progress, so it's a communal thing that all of us are supplying. But then the other world, it's a different thing altogether. So please do not grow despondent.
The same thing you say, teaching is going to address, because like you rightly put it, when Jesus came, he identified 12 persons. He took them into a private class and kept on teaching them, and then from there, he increased into 70, and then the 140. I know that as time goes on, all that come on air here may not be Christians. So, do you have a plan for addressing this sects? And do you have a way of, harmonizing the ideology, the thought process, the schools of thought in such a way that everybody can, flow and get a clear understanding of what the school is all about?
Thank you so much. And on the last part, which is about the ideology, Boqer School of Government is a religious school, and we're dedicated solely to drawing out and applying biblical concepts to contemporary governance and governmental systems. Why do we do this? We are drawing out, we are not philosophers, we are not Aristotle, we are not drawing from, it's the Bible that we are drawing out from. Because even businessmen who are not Christians sometimes apply biblical concepts to their business to their own advantage, right? And that's why this class, Christians will benefit maximally from what we are teaching, because some of them already have a prior knowledge or a prior background of what we're discussing. But then the class does not foreclose the participation of non-Christians who may draw out things from here that they can apply to their respective lives, either business or governance. But then we're dealing with the society and then how the society is governed. So that's essentially where we are going to. We're not going to see us a time where we can now elevate Aristotle above the scriptures or try to balance it. There are several schools of thought. This one is basically a biblical school of thought. We are not going to impose it on everybody, but then there are things you could say there's a biblical concept for instance, the things we taught today. A Christian can apply it. A Muslim can be fair to their staff. a non-Christian can be fair to their staff, even if not just for the religious appellations. I understand the point you raised, but then we have remained focused, and even on our registration and on our social media, we keep saying that Boqer is a religious school dedicated to drawing out biblical principles, so that anybody who comes here know that the Bible is the main context or the text where we draw out material from. So thank you once again, my dear brother.
So there's something I pointed out last week when I said that some of the ideal governance models that we've seen in the Bible were usually short-lived.
Yes.
And then someone said that, I don't know where I got this, but it's a theologian that said that every fresh move of God ends in man's hand as the new orthodoxy, which means what we call orthodoxy now used to be a move of God. So God was the principal ruler with Adam and Eve. I don't know how long that thing lasted, but if we were to check the Bible, it started well. Within 3 chapters, we start seeing issues, when God was totally in charge. So I want to believe, so this is me expressing my faith in how things are run. I want to believe that some of the imperfect models that we are having in the development of men's ideas and ideologies about leadership, about politics, about social life, they are things that you talked about inspiration. There are things that are getting from divinity. There's something on my status today, and it's an art that somebody did using wood to craft a dog. It is difficult for anybody to look at that and think it's from wood. It looked very real. So that, I said that art is divine. I believe that some of the inspirations we are getting, of course, we know that some are demonic, but we should not outrightly think that if it is something that is coming or emanating from men, that it's tainted with imperfection. Because God already knows. Like someone says, forgive earth for not being heaven. I believe that some of the most ideal, if it is going to be practiced by men, they are going to come out not perfect. So whatever progress we are making, we're supposed to appreciate it. Ideal life, because I've been a victim of this, where I'm a very idealistic person, and I found out that, like Solomon would say, that it's much book is weariness to the soul. So I don't want to look at life with the prism of this is imperfect, and when God brings His own, it will now be perfect. If God brings that the ideal which He has been bringing, we taint it. Because jealousy, Jesus came Himself, wanted to fix everything. Jealousy. Look at good luck, Jonathan. Jealousy. So this heart of man is what the problem is, not necessarily in the system that God is bringing. So I want to if you just throw light on this perspective. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. A lot of people believe that Jesus Christ was not interested in government, but that's far from the truth. But then His approach to government and governance was part of what you just said now. The last question His disciples asked Him, I think it is in Acts chapter 2, or is it chapter 3, where they asked Him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And He answered them, He said, it's not appointed unto you to know times and seasons that the Father has appointed for Himself. But then you shall receive power after the Holy Ghost has come on you, and you will be my witnesses and disciples to all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have taught you. Because what Jesus diagnosed as the problem was the heart of man, just like you said, right? That the kingdom that they lost was as a result of the corruption in the heart of man. So Jesus came to fix that heart, that if you allow that heart to be fixed, it will reflect in the way man does business. If you allow that heart to be fixed, it will reflect in the way he treats his companions, his neighbors. If you allow that heart to be fixed, you will see it in governmental systems. But then, you rather want to have a good system run by imperfect humans, right, than to have obviously demonic systems. And I'll give you instances. And this is part of, maybe it might not even be in our first 10 classes, but if God gives us the grace, we will consider them. Some of the things we eat, we wear today. For instance, if you read the history of what we call broilers today, what do you call it? That's the chicken we eat, the broilers, right? We call it agric chicken. Agric chicken was as a result of experimentation in the USA. They were trying to experiment, how do you produce chicken faster? How do you get it to grow bigger? How do you produce bigger meats? How do you do that? And all of the things around. And eventually, broiler won the competition. And so the government gave those research guys the money to mass produce broilers, because broiler was the one they felt it grows quickly, it can grow in a controlled environment, they had more resistance to sickness. So they did all of those things and they started growing that. But today you see that even the rich in America don't eat broilers. They don't eat those fast foods. They go for the organic ones. And so for Africa, what we now call our cooks, like you now see a lot of Africans telling you, no, I don't eat all these local chicken. That local chicken is the one rich people in the United States eat. They don't eat your factory produced chicken. It's factory produced chicken is for the everyday people. The others go for the organic ones. And then here in Africa, we're using the organic one to say, no, if you're eating organic one, you are poor, you're not this. We have, these things running around us. But then you will see that the gift of the Lord makes rich and adds no sorrow. If that gift comes from the devil, it will add sorrow. And so you see that from what we eat and from the abundance of food, we now have high yield crops, pest resistant crops, this, that, the other crops, genetically modified this, artificially modified this. That in that process of having these modifications, yes, we have better yield. It is bigger now. Okay, I'll give you an instance. Did you know that if you had noticed, if you're living in Nigeria, you notice that if you eat cassava, like pounded cassava, I think they call it Santana in some places, pounded cassava, like you eat in restaurants. When we were much younger, pounded cassava used to smell. Like if you eat cassava and you go to bed, it will still be smelling that. Even the next day, cassava will still be smelling in your hand. But today, cassava of today no longer smell. And part of the reason is that people who process cassava add chemicals to it. Now they add chemicals to ferment faster. They also add chemicals so that the fermented cassava can rise and give them more profits. If you go to some places around town, you see that people who even do bananas, sell bananas, now know how to pour carbide and hot water on their banana so that their banana can ripen in 2 or 3 days or in 4 days. So from the time they get the banana to the time they supply to the market, they have used extra methods to get it to ripen so that they will make more profits. These inspirations that force you to make profits, to add dangerous chemicals to food so that you can make profits, to start pumping in chemicals into animals so that they can become bigger, you can get more yield. If it is not from God, it will add sorrow. Because the only person that gives you blessings and adds no sorrow is God. If your inspiration for getting bigger yield is not from God, be sure that you have cancer attached to it. And then the dangerous thing now is that if someone eats those GMOs and die the next day, nobody will eat it. But then these GMOs are so insidious that sometimes it spreads out. So it's not as if you ingest it today and you have, but then as you ingest it, it is modifying your internal organisms, modifying, and then eventually there are research work to this. So I'm not speaking out of this. But then again, I'm referring to the scriptures, not more to the research work, but there's research work to what I'm saying. That we have seen that in the prevalence of processed foods and modified foods, that we are seeing the increase in diseases and sicknesses that didn't used to be there before now. So taking this, bring it back to the concepts that you can run your systems based on, for instance, Robert Greene's philosophy of life. Don't outshine your master. Don't do this. Don't allow You can run your life based on 44 laws of power. Or is it 48 laws of power? There are people, when you see their companies, you know that they are running their companies on 44 laws. Or is it 48 laws? When you see their businesses are modeled after these laws. But then you see that these laws, either they hurt you or they hurt people around you. And so that is the same thing with systems of the world that are gleaned from this, that they leave things in its wake. When you now come to godly systems work if men are willing to work it. But what we've seen, like you mentioned, is that every move of God, people tend to corrupt it. But then you don't get afraid. Like Bishop Cooker said, I think 2 weeks ago, or is it last week in Kaduna, he said every generation will have their problem. So like now that we're starting Boqer School of Government, and we're beginning to tell people, look, God is interested in the way your judiciary is run. God is interested in the way your lawmakers run. God is interested in how your governance is. And this is his views on this. Even if we cannot get back to the original intent, can we come back to at least what theologians call permissive will? And then can we run on this model? And this is how to do it. For instance, when Jesus was giving a parable, he says, there is this judge that fears not man nor God. He was using that to teach prayer. But did you know that we could have applied that parable to our Supreme Court? Because it says that the Supreme Court or the judge eventually gave the woman what she wanted, not because he fears God, not because he fears man, but because the woman will not allow him to rest. And that was what we could have gleaned. In fact, if you had seen my post-election intervention on Nigeria's judiciary, it was from that scripture. Because I said, look, we have to worry the Supreme Court until they give. We have to worry them. Not posting all eyes on judiciary, but actual plans on how to get these things down. Anyway, I'm now getting ahead of myself. But the point is this, that despite the fact that godly systems can be misapplied by imperfect men, we will not be tired or weary of applying them. Let this generation start off something. We know that the next generation will corrupt it, but then let us have something that works. Then eventually, what happens is that each move of God, each revival, it achieves its purpose, then it gets derailed. And then it gets derailed for a long time. And then God starts plotting his way again, finds another set of people who are willing to work with him. They work again, and then when they're out of the scene, it gets derailed again. But then, if God is now willing to do something again in the political system in our own time, I believe that it's up to us to at least partner with him and do that with him. So that's why we're here. And then as we are doing this here, be sure that God is also raising people we don't even know somewhere else. They are doing their things. Like now, people have not heard of. There are a lot of people who have not heard of the things I'm doing. And then when eventually, for instance, 5-10 years from now, when God decides to announce me or whatever, then there are people in their caves, like God told Prophet Elijah. So you are not the only person who has not bowed down to Baal. I think I have, is it 5,000 or is it 7,000 prophets? He said I have a lot of people, prophets, who have not bowed down to Baal. So there are a lot of young people who God is teaching what he's teaching us now, to try to bring back biblical concepts to modern day governance and government systems. And so in the fullness of time, we will hear them, we will connect with them. And so the small parchment of fire we are building here, be assured that there are people building their own elsewhere. Then eventually, if it pleases God, it will connect us and it might become a big movement. And then God will, through this, do what he intends to do for our generation. So thank you so much, Uche, and I appreciate that you keep coming back, and then each of your contributions are spot on. Thank you. So does anyone have a question before we call it a day?
I think today is a listening day for me.
Okay.
Because I really want to just, absorb a lot of other views, and I'm loving the angle is going, with respect to seeing the school of government that we're building here, or we're listening to here. And like you said, just the same way God gave every one of us various callings, there's some other people in some kind of circle that are probably doing theirs, and at God appointed time, there'll be a link. There's always a link in all these things when it's the time. But it's our job now to be able to get ready and be prepared, so we're not caught off guard and we're not surprised. And probably through the Boqer School of Government, we begin to build leaders through the Christian principles. and implement it at the end of the day. But the goal, I think, for me, the common factor is that we finally have leaderships that have principles. That's what we're lacking in our current Nigerian society. They have various things that they are ruled on, but I don't think that they are maybe ruled by maybe human-centric principles and service-oriented principles. They are ruled by different kinds of principles: survival tactics, maneuvering, cheats, all those kinds of various principles. And this is me, speaking to those particular percentage of people that falls fall into this category, basically. But I'm not saying that there are no leaders, even in this country, that are also guided by Christian principles. It's just that they need more soldiers in this particular field. So if we're able to raise more, we can join hands with those that are already in. Together we can do magic again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And then Mubanga Wena.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. My question is, where do you think we messed it up to be in this situation we are in, where the West are exploiting us, exploiting our minerals, where education system is programmed to suit their agenda? Where do we think we lost it? We lost our civilization. As we embark on the emancipation of Africa, where do we start from? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mubanga. Could you please tell us the country you're from?
I'm from Zambia.
Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, accept my condolences on the coal miners who are still trapped. We are following the news, and prayers and best wishes are with them. Yes, your question is about civilization. If you look at the way the world works, for out of lack of better language, let me use it this way: the world is a standing fan. Is a standing fan that rotates. It rotates to the left, it comes to the middle, it goes to the right, comes back to the middle, goes to the left. It rotates. And so for every time, no particular civilization has been able to hold it down for a long period of time. And then what usually happens is that anytime a particular space is holding it down, they tend to exploit people. Make no mistake, Africa exploited others. Africa also exploited itself. If you look at the few civilizations that we know of in Africa, for instance, let's go to Egypt. Egypt exploited the slaves in that 400 years they had. It was a brutal exploitation. In fact, it was at that period that Egypt got to the zenith. Yes, Egypt was doing well before Israelis came into Egypt. But then it was in the period that they were there, especially the period of cheap labor. In fact, it wasn't even cheap labor, it was free labor. It was in that period of free labor, plus cane, plus flogging, plus you must do your quota, that they achieved the maximal or the full capacity utilization of that country. If you go to Ethiopia, for instance, which was a trading nation, Ethiopia was a trading nation. And if you read the history of Ethiopia, they are not just traders and merchants, they are also warfarers. So, and then because of where they are, you had that, in fact, at some point, Ethiopia waged war with Israel, sometimes with other countries. And many a times they won, others they lost. And so each time they wage war with another country, some of the countries in the Middle East, a lot of them in the Middle East, by the way, which are not Africans in the proper sense of, or in this geographical definition of Africa. And then what happens is, if you wage war, you plunder their goods, you take their cattle, you kill off the men, or you turn them to slaves, you take their wives and their children, and then you force them to serve you, you take their gold. It was brutal exploitation. So make no mistake, Africa is not the innocent victim here. Africa has also victimized other countries, other nations at some point during the period of recorded history. You may say not necessarily West Africa or East Africa, but then the few civilizations we've seen that are in recorded history in Africa, they had the history of exploitation. So what happened is that, because we've discussed in this class that exploitation is not sustainable, at some point you're going to lose it. And today, Egypt lost it, of course. Ethiopia lost it, of course. Today, Ethiopia is trying to rebuild back, and then they've been set back again by the civil war. By the way, they had wars with Eritrea, and then after that, you had so this tribal thing in Ethiopia, because a lot of Nigerians talk about, or Africans talk about tribe. You know, there are places where it's on the surface. If you go to Ethiopia, the tribalism is wearing clothes. We can even pretend about it. But there is on the surface. You will see it, you will breathe it, you will hear it, you smell it. And so Africa is not the victim here, innocent victim here. And believe me, if we don't run Africa by godly civilization, when we achieve full capacity utilization, we will exploit. We will even do to others much worse than they've done to us. And that is the heart of man. That is the heart of man. It just so appears that at this point in our history, that we came at a point that your generation, my generation, our parents' generation, the previous one before that, we are at a point where the fan has rotated, moved away, and started blowing the west. And the west was enjoying the breeze of the fan, whereas the others were not enjoying. And then as the west was trying to do that, it moved from the west now. It is now trying to start blowing. It has not even started blowing well in Asia. Because by the time Asia mounts up properly, Africa will see what is exploitation. A lot of African countries, African lands, mineral resources, they will do worse to Africa what the West did to Africa if we allow them. And our leaders are already playing into their hands through unsustainable debts, unsustainable deals, a lot of things. Even Zambia is going into the hands of, you know this story. So the East will do even worse than what the West did during their time of exploitation. But then Africa's morning will come. And this morning, it's in the neighborhood of 40 to 70 years, or even less than that. It's in the neighborhood of that. And so what you're going to see is not just Nigeria, it's not just South Africa. You see that the whole of Africa, it will be as if there is a tide that is lifting the whole of Africa. And that's because the fan has faced Africa. And once it faces Africa, everybody will be lifted, not equally. For instance, what is happening in Asia, China will still be China. Japan will still be Japan. There are others that will not be as big as China. I think the dominant players we don't even know who the dominant players in Asia will be. Because if you had made this judgment in the 80s, you would think that, for instance, Japan would have been the dominant player. But Japan wasn't. So today, China has overtaken Japan. Although Japan is still a wonderful civilization, but then people are no longer seeing them as that superpower, So we don't even know between what China and India is doing. We don't even know which one will be it. It might be India eventually. It might be China. But what we have seen from studying history is that any country that will lead the pack among the Committee of Nations in that particular vicinity must have population. If they don't have the numbers, they quickly assemble a protectorate or what you could call, like what the Brits did. Brits didn't have the numbers. Also, when the time of Rome was there, Rome didn't have the numbers. But then what they did was that they assembled, they had a lot of countries that they were ruling from Rome. Like you had a lot of countries that the King and Queen of England were ruling from England. So they had people. So anyone that will mount up must have people. So eventually it might be Malaysia or any of those tiny countries. But when they get their acts together, they will find a way to start colonizing the rest. And then they will achieve that. They will lead the pack. So that's why Nigeria might not necessarily, when people are saying Nigeria is a giant of Africa, we're looking at just numbers. If South Africa gets their acts together, they can export exploitation. And anyone that can be able to export exploitation will lead the pack if we're going to build civilization based on exploitation. So there's no guarantee that when Africa mounts up with wings, that we're able to sustain it. So yes, the next generation of Africa, or maybe our generation, will experience it in parts, and then the next one will experience it in full. But then after their time, it will turn around and move away to wherever it wills, perhaps go back to the West. And by the way, what we're seeing is the gradual decline of the West. And I want you guys to watch what will happen with the next America's election. That you will see that some of the things that were discussed in elections in Nigeria, rigging, ballot box snatching, compromise of election systems, you will begin to hear about those things in the West. That's terminal decline. Part of Britain's terminal decline is the Brexit. And some of the today elections in Britain, for people who know, yes, they still retain that sanctity of the ballot, but then they compromise the ballot before you even cast it by propaganda, by a lot of lies and all of those things. Eventually, people will see that lies and propaganda can no longer get them the ballot. Britain will revert back to ballot box snatching, because that's how civilizations, they get to the peak and then they start declining. I've said much more than I should have said on this, but I hope that makes sense. And if you have further questions, please ask before we draw the curtains on this class. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And it appears now that the class will be on Tuesdays, God willing. We'll continue to work hard to develop the curricula and to bring in interesting conversations. But the goal of these conversations really is not to come and have nice discussions. It's to build the framework, because look, we are the next generation of the leaders. If we don't prepare ourselves well, what happened to our predecessors will happen to us. You see, the same people who fought the colonial masters and fought for Africa's independence, some of them even died. Eventually they got the independence and they turned around and started colonizing Africa. They turned around and started colonizing their brothers. And then the military stayed in the barracks and said, no, these people are not doing it right. The military was agitating, let us get there and clean up the system. The military got there, and then eventually we know the history. Military became worse than the politicians that they kicked out. And again, another set of people rose. We no go agree. Military cannot rule us. We kicked out the military, and the same people who kicked out the military, who paid the ultimate price to kick out the military, came in power, and they are worse than the military they kicked out. And so you see that the people who occupied Nigeria in 2012 are now in government, and they are worse than the people they kicked out. And this should give us, this is what I think, and it gives me chills. Like, if all I'm doing now, eventually, I know I will get into government. I have no doubt about it. But then, the question I keep asking, if we get there, what is the guarantee that we will not be worse than the people? These people that protested police brutality, this us that protested police brutality, when we have police protection, when we now ride convoys, are we sure that our policemen will not be driving people off the streets? Are we sure that we will not use police to keep a stranglehold on our power? How are we sure that we're not going to abuse the powers that we're giving? Because every generation that has had powers without training have abused the powers they had. So this is why we're at Boqer School of Government. It's not just to come and discuss, but to build in the software that when we eventually get into power, we have philosophies that we run our lives by. We have principles. We have do's. We know what's that. And our problem will no longer be ignorance, because some people can be acting in ignorance, but then some can be acting in rebellion. But then we want to know what to do. We want to know what the right things are, so that when we get there, our problem will now be that we choose to do wrong as against choosing to do right. Like, for instance, the class we taught last week on the desensitization of civil servants, that people can decide to write off money. People can write off money because they see it as fast business. But if you had attended that Boqer School of Government, you now know that your signature could have life-threatening implications. And if you still want to use that signature to write away people's life, you can go ahead and do so. But then don't pretend that you don't know the implications of what you're doing. A lot of people who do that don't know the implications, and others do that knowing the implications. And maybe one of these days, we will consider, why do people know the implications of their actions, yet they go ahead to take those actions? Perhaps maybe those will be one of our, or maybe to come in the Q&A of one of our classes, or it could come alone as a standalone topic. But I thank each and every one of us for participating, and I pray that we'll keep these things to heart, and that even in our small businesses now, our small affairs now, our small groups that we're leading, and our small spheres of influence, that will begin to run our lives by some of these principles and other godly principles that we've learned, both here and on other platforms, so that we now becomes a substantial core of our being, that when we now get into higher positions of responsibility, we stand a good chance of using our powers for good. Thank you so very much, everyone, and have a good night's rest.